Hi guys, it's Dan here, and today I wanted to do like a bookshelf tour because, you know, when I'm reviewing books, basically I'm being completely subjective. You know, it's all down to my personal taste as to how I'm reviewing them. So I thought it would be a good idea for, you know, if you're interested, you could get an idea of what my taste in books is, and that might give you more of an idea of the kind of things you'd be looking for in my reviews and whether they match to your taste. So as you can see, there are quite a few books here, so I think what I'm going to do is split it down into like maybe a series of videos. So I guess I'll start off doing the fiction, and I'll do it in like sort of vaguely alphabetical order by author's surname, which is how it is on the shelves. Okay, so first up we've got a chipped stoneware jug full of feathers that I'm kind of planning to use to decorate some woodworking projects in the future. And kicking things off for the book part of the bookshelf tour, we've got some grimdark fantasy, the first book in the first Law trilogy, The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, Book 2, Before They Are Hanged, and Book 3, Last Argument of Kings. And then we've got 4 books by James Aitchison, all of them based around the time of the Norman conquest of England. These are all historical fiction. First off we've got Sworn Sword, The Splintered Kingdom, Knights of the Hawk, and finally The Harrowing. Then some more historical fiction, this time set in the Anglo-Saxon period. We've got Oswald, The Return of the King by Eduardo Albert. Then some Cold War spy fiction by Ted Albury. We've got Show Me a Hero and The Long Run. And then we've got some historical fiction set during the English Civil War, Traitor's Blood by Michael Arnold. And then we've got a series that I'm kind of in the process of collecting. It's the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. This is the 4th book, Foundation's Edge. This is like classic science fiction. And the final book, Forward the Foundation. Next up we've got some prehistoric fiction, the Earth's Children series by Jean M. Auel. First off, The Clan of the Cave Bear, then The Valley of Horses, The Mammoth Hunters, The Plains of Passage, and The Shelters of Stone. Following that we've got Quest for Honor by Sam Barone, which is historical fiction set in ancient Mesopotamia. And then we've got a novel set in Dark Age Britain, Credo by Melvin Bragg. We've got Peter V. Brett's fantasy novel, The Painted Man. And then The Postman by David Brin, which is post-apocalyptic fiction. The Brief History of the Dead by Kevin Brockmeyer. Actually not really sure what that is. And then we come on to my Christian Cameron collection. Now Christian Cameron is an absolutely fantastic author, so all of the books that I'm going to go through now by him I would highly recommend. This is the first book in his Long War series. It's set during the Persian Wars, ancient Greek period. First up we've got Killer of Men, then Marathon, Poseidon's Spear, The Great King, Salamis, and the last book in this series, Rage of Ares. And that brings us on to the second shelf. Now a bit of decoration here. I've got a back saw that I recently purchased, and also my Travisher, which is quite a rare tool actually. You use it for like shaping chair seats. It's kind of convex spoke shave, I guess. So continuing with the Christian Cameron books, we've got his standalone novel on Alexander the Great called Alexander God of War. And then we've got the first book in his Tyrant series, which is more historical fiction set around the period just after the death of Alexander the Great, so during the successor wars following that. And this first one in the series is called Tyrant. Next up is Storm of Arrows, then Funeral Games, King of the Bosporus, Destroyer of Cities, and finally Force of Kings. And then we've got a series that he is currently working on. This is his Chivalry series set during the 100 Years' War period in Europe. First up we've got The Ill-Made Knight, then The Long Sword, and finally, or at least finally that I own, The Green Count. And then there's his standalone novel Washington and Caesar, set during the American War for Independence. And then we move on to the Traitor Son cycle, which is a fantasy series that he's done under the pen name of Miles Cameron. The first one here is The Red Knight. Then we've got The Fell Sword, The Dread Worm, A Plague of Swords, and the last Christian / Miles Cameron book that I own, The Fall of Dragons. Next up we've got 2 fantasy books by Trudy Canavan. Firstly we've got The Magician's Apprentice, which is the prequel to this book, The Magician's Guild, the first book in the Black Magician trilogy. Then we've got kind of some mystical realism, I guess, set during the 15th century, The Language of the Stones by Robert Carter. Then we've got The Greatest Night by Elizabeth Chadwick, which tells the story of William Marshall. Lindsay Clark's take on the Odyssey, The Return from Troy. And finally for this shelf we've got some historical fiction set during feudal Japan, Shogun by James Clavell. Right, so moving on to shelf number 3 then. First of all I've got a set of 3 combination squares, very useful tools for marking out. Right, and kicking us off then on this shelf we've got some Grimdark Fantasy by Glenn Cook. This is an omnibus edition of the first 3 books in his Black Company series, called The Chronicles of the Black Company, and it contains The Black Company, Shadows Linger and The White Rose. This is some really good fantasy. And next up we come to another very well represented author in my collection. If you've watched my channel before you'll have seen me doing some book reviews of a series, the Last Kingdom series, which is by Bernard Cornwell. This is a standalone novel that he did about Stonehenge, called Stonehenge, a novel of 2000 BC. And then we have the first book in the Last Kingdom series itself. There was also a TV series of this. This one is called The Last Kingdom, and the first 5 books of this series I've got in a matching box set that my sister got me, so thank you for that, Emma. Then we've got The Pale Horseman, The Lords of the North, Sword Song, The Burning Land, Death of Kings, The Pagan Lord, The Empty Throne, Warriors of the Storm, and The Flame Bearer. Now I'm working through a reread of this series, so I'm doing individual reviews for all of the books in it, so you can check them out if you want. There's also another book that I don't own, I think it's called The Way of the Wolf, which comes on the end of the series. It's the latest one. I've not read that yet, so once I've finished my reread I'll probably get that and do a review of it as well. Next up we've got Bernard Cornwell's trilogy about King Arthur, starting with The Winter King, then Enemy of God, and finishing up with Excalibur. Next we've got his Grail Quest series set during the 100 Years' War, starting with Harlequin, then Vagabond, and lastly in the main Grail Quest trilogy, Heretic. But there are 2 side novels with a lot of the same characters as the Grail Quest series. The first one is this, 1356, which chronicles the Battle of Poitiers, and then Agincourt, which chronicles the battle of the same name. And then lastly by Bernard Cornwell I've got the first 2 books in his Starbuck Chronicles series, which is set during the American Civil War. First up we've got Rebel, and then Copperhead. Then we've got one of the few indie novels that I possess. This one is set during Roman Britain and it's called Britannia, Part 1, The Wall, by Richard Denham and M.J. Troe. Then some classic science fiction by Philip K. Dick. We've got Ubik. I also did a review of this one that you can check out if you want. Then some historical fiction set during the Crusades. We've got The Templar by Paul Doherty. And then finally for this shelf we've got Angus Donald's Outlaw series, which is an 8-book series about his take on the legend of Robin Hood. First up we've got Outlaw, Holy Warrior, King's Man, Grail Knight, Warlord, The Iron Castle, The King's Assassin, and lastly The Death of Robin Hood. Right, so moving on to the next shelf. That beast is an old plane that I refurbished and it works really well now actually. It's kind of halfway between a jack plane and a jointer plane. It's useful for getting rid of loads of material. Now first up in terms of books on this shelf we've got Stephen Donaldson's Lord Foulsbane, which is the first book in his first trilogy about Thomas Covenant, which is like this epic fantasy series, sort of parallel dimension type thing. And the second one in that series is the Ill-Earth War, and wrapping up that trilogy is The Power That Preserves. And this is an omnibus edition of the Second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, which contains The Wounded Land, The One Tree and White Gold Wielder. And then we've got The Runes of the Earth, which is the last chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Then we've got 2 short historical fiction novels by Alfred Duggan. First we've got Winter Quarters, and then Count Beaumont. Next up, some more historical fiction. We've got David Anthony Durham's Hannibal, Pride of Carthage. And then a bit of satire, we've got This Other Eden by Ben Elton. And the rest of this shelf is taken up by what is one of my favourite fantasy series, and if you like anything like epic fantasy with a really grand scope, I would highly recommend trying this out. It's a bit hard to get into, but once you do, it is brilliant. And that is the Malazan Book of the Fallen series by Stephen Erickson. This is the first book, Gardens of the Moon. Then we have Dead House Gates, Memories of Ice, House of Chains, Midnight Tides, The Bone Hunters, Reaper's Gale, Toll the Hounds, Dust of Dreams, and finally The Crippled God. Right, and that brings us down to the 5th shelf, and first off we've got a lovely little Axminster Rider number 220 block plane, and behind that we've got my Swanson Speed Square, which is really useful as a circular saw guide as well, by the way. And the first book on this shelf is another one in the Malazan Book of the Fallen universe, but it's by a different author. This is Knight of Knives by Ian C. Esselmont. Then we've got the first of 5 books by Robert Fabry, all historical fiction about the Roman Empire. Firstly, we've got Arminius, The Limits of Empire, Vespasian, Tribune of Rome, Rome's Fallen Eagle, Masters of Rome, and finally The Furies of Rome. Next we've got a bunch of fantasy novels that I've not read yet because I only just recently picked them up in an audio vlog that I did, so you can check that out if you want. This first one is a collaboration between Raymond E. Feist and Steve Sterling, and it is called Jimmy the Hand, Legends of the Rift War. And the next few are all solely authored by Raymond E. Feist. First of all we've got Prince of the Blood, then The King's Buccaneer, Shadow of a Dark Queen, Rise of a Merchant Prince, Rage of a Demon King, Shards of a Broken Crown, and lastly by Raymond E. Feist, Talon of the Silver Hawk. Then we've got 2 absolute classics of historical fiction. We've got Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth, and the sequel, World Without End. And this is like a weird little postmodern fantasy that I got from a library sale, which is quite good actually. It's The Physiognomy by Geoffrey Ford. And then we've got a fantasy that I haven't read yet. It's Herald of the Storm by Richard Ford. Then we've got a time travel novel by Stephen Fry called Making History. And 3 historical fantasies by David Gemmell. First up, Lion of Macedon. Then Dark Prince. And finally Ghost King. Then we've got William Golding's Lord of the Flies. And some historical fiction set in Roman Britain, Vindolanda by Adrian Goldsworthy. I've also got a review for this up if you want to check that out. And last up on this shelf we've got Jan Guillau's The Crusades trilogy. Firstly, The Road to Jerusalem, then The Templar Knight, and finally Birth of the Kingdom. Okay, so that was part 1 of the bookshelf tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and because I think it's going to be quite a lot of editing, I reckon I'll stop now and I'll give you part 2 when I get round to it. Carrying on with the fiction probably.